Have you ever stopped to think about what actually makes something sacred? I mean, really, what is it? Is it the thing itself, its perfect form? Or is it something else? Well, we're about to dive into this incredible ancient debate that gets right to the heart of that question. It's all about how an everyday object, like a cup or a bowl, could become holy in the Jerusalem temple, and, just as important, how it could lose that power. Trust me, this isn't just about old rituals. It's a deep look into the nature of holiness itself.
So this is the big question, right? How does a regular object suddenly become holy? And what could possibly make it lose that magic? The ancient sages of the Talmud wrestled with this for, well, generations. Was it all about physical perfection? Did it have to be used for a specific purpose? Or was there some other force at play? Let's see how they tried to figure it all out.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll cover the basic idea of how these special vessels even worked. Then we'll get into the specific rules for matching them up with offerings. After that, we dive into the nitty-gritty of the debate. Then we'll explore what happens when these sacred things break. And finally, we'll pull it all together and see what it reveals about the, honestly, surprising power of human intention.
All right, let's start at the beginning with the foundational concept. In the ancient temple, you had these objects that weren't just containers. Nope, they were seen as instruments with a real, actual, transformative power.
This whole process is called sanctification. The idea was that the moment an offering, flour, wine, oil, whatever, was put inside one of these designated service vessels, poof, it instantly changed. It was no longer just flour or wine, it became holy, totally set apart for a sacred purpose. But, as you can probably guess, it wasn't quite that simple.
Okay, so let's look at the first big rule. The earliest layer of rabbinic law, the Mishnah. It lays out a really clear and logical starting point. And it's all about specialization. The initial rule is pretty straightforward. You had vessels for liquids, things like wine, oil, or blood, and they could only make other liquids holy. And on the flip side, you had vessels made for dry stuff, like flour, and they could only sanctify dry goods. You couldn't mix and match. A liquid cup had zero power over a bunch of flour, and a dry measure bowl couldn't do anything to wine. Simple enough, right? Well, not for long.
This is where the whole discussion just comes alive. You see, later sages, they weren't satisfied with that simple rule. They started poking at the edges, looking for exceptions, trying to find the deeper principles. And this is where a scholar named Shmuel steps onto the scene.
Shmuel basically throws a wrench in the whole system. He points to a verse right out of the Bible, from the book of Numbers, where cups, which are definitely liquid vessels, are described as being filled with a flour offering. He's found biblical proof that seems to fly right in the face of the Mishnah's neat and tidy rule. A liquid vessel was used for a dry item.
But of course, the debate doesn't stop there. Another sage, Rav Acha, immediately fires back. He says, whoa, hold on, a meal offering isn't completely dry. The verse says it's flour mingled with oil. His point is brilliant. The oil turns the whole thing into a kind of thick paste, so maybe it's not a dry offering at all. Maybe Shmuel's proof doesn't really count. It's still a liquidish thing in a liquid vessel.
And this is where the argument just gets so clever. A third sage, Ravina, jumps in to defend Shmuel with two killer points. First, he says the cup's sanctifying power is so immense that it makes holy even the tiny little pockets of flour that the oil didn't even touch. And his second argument is all about relativity. Sure, it's a paste, but compared to a pure liquid like blood, that flour and oil mixture is still fundamentally dry. Boom! Both arguments totally save Shmuel's case.
So, to tighten up his argument, Shmuel lays down three critical conditions. First, the vessel has to be physically perfect, no holes, not a single one. Wholeness is essential. Second, it has to contain a full, proper measure for an offering. You can't just put a pinch of flour in a giant bowl and call it sanctified. And finally, the power is strictly internal. The offering has to be inside the vessel. Just touching the outside does nothing.
Now, just when you think you've got it all figured out, that it's all about physical rules, Rabbi Yochanan comes in with his absolutely mind-bending exception. He says the full measure rule can be completely overridden by what's in a person's head. If a priest is filling a vessel and he intends to fill it all the way, then the very first drop he pours in becomes holy. Instantly. Suddenly, sanctity isn't just about volume, it's about purpose, it's about intention. Okay, so if physical perfection is so important, what happens when these sacred objects get damaged? This next part really shows just how fragile this holy status could actually be.
So, before we can talk about broken things, we have to get this one subtle but super important idea. The sages saw two different kinds of holiness. Sanctified to be offered is the goal. It's perfect, it's holy, it's ready for the altar. But then there's this other category, sanctified to be disqualified. This happens when you mess up, like putting flour in a liquid vessel. The item can't be used for a sacrifice, but, and this is the key, it becomes just holy enough that it can now be ruined by ritual impurity. It gains this kind of sacred vulnerability.
And the rules for damage were just incredibly strict. You couldn't just patch up a holy vessel. You couldn't sharpen a sacred knife if it got a nick in it. If a blade came off its handle, that was it. You couldn't just stick it back on. The whole idea was this pristine, original wholeness. Any repair was seen as a violation of that perfect state.
There's this amazing story from a sage named Abba Shaul that just perfectly captures this commitment to perfection. He says there was this one knife in the temple made of a really soft metal that got damaged all the time. So what did the priests do? Rather than risk using a flawed tool, they actually held a vote and decided to hide it away forever. They chose to take it out of service completely rather than compromise on that ideal of perfection.
So after all of these rules, all these exceptions, these intense debates, what's the big picture here? What does this all really tell us about how these ancient thinkers understood the whole concept of holiness?
It really all comes down to this fascinating balancing act. On one side, you've got this intense focus on the physical world. Perfect vessels, full measures, the right materials. The object itself has to be just right. But then, on the other side, you have the undeniable, incredible power of the human mind. A priest's intention can make the very first drop holy. The entire debate just lives in that tension, right between those two ideas.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about. When it comes to creating something sacred, what ultimately matters more? The flawless, physical perfection of the object, or the focused, purposeful intention of the person who's using it? The Talmud doesn't give us one easy answer. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point.